Boris Tsessarsky, am I doing that justice?
Sounds good.
Is a filmmaker and a fiction writer. Currently, he's working on a collection of speculative post-war stories. You can ask him what that means. He's a graduate of the MFA program at Sarah Lawrence College. His stories have appeared or are forthcoming in Folio, Temenos Journal, and PIF. He teaches writing here at William Paterson. So welcome, Boris.
Where do people typically read from here?
Anywhere you feel comfortable.
Okay, okay. So anyway, thanks you guys for making it. I want to thank Wes, of course, for organizing the event, for asking me to read at it. And again, thank you to all of you guys for making it out, both my class and everybody else, so thanks. So I'm going to read to you guys from a story. I'm going to read an excerpt from the story, so not the whole story, but just part of it. And I've been working on a collection of stories that deal with the theme of war and the effects of war. By that I mean the effects on war veterans, on civilians living in combat zones. And I often draw on my stories from certain events that go on in places like the Middle East. However, rather than pick a place like Syria or Israel or Lebanon, I've created two imaginary places, which is what is the speculative element. And these places are called Sultan and Aurelia. And they're both symbolic of what's going on in the Middle East.
And a little bit louder, maybe.
A little bit louder?
Just testing back here. Would that be better? A little bit louder if you can.
Okay, okay. A little bit louder. So anyway, the story that I'm going to read to you guys has two places called Sultan and Aurelia, and if you're wondering what those places are, they're sort of symbolic of the Middle East. So I'm going to read from a story called A Nest of Arms, and it's about a young female war veteran on the day of her job interview. And I'm going to read two scenes, the morning of the interview, and then I'm going to read the trip to the interview. So here it is, scene one from A Nest of Arms. It was almost 6 a.m., and Heidi lay awake in bed, trying not to think about the war. Lately, when she looked at her girlfriend, Dara, she was reminded of a Sultanese woman, a civilian, that her unit had fired on. The woman had been carrying a basket full of fruit, which from a distance posed a threat, possibly held an explosive device that could have killed several soldiers. What reminded Heidi of her was not Dara's long curly hair, so like the woman's, but a look in her eyes, a look of feigned surprise that the woman maintained even after she died and lay surrounded by bananas and pears. Those eyes, jeering eyes, were just like Dara's. But Heidi couldn't tell her that. How do you tell someone to remove the look in their eyes? Heidi had fired on the innocent woman. They were there to help bring order to Sultan after its conflict with Aurelia, America's biggest Middle East ally. But certain civilians and rogue military units retaliated. Back home in New Jersey, there was no fighting. Only residential blocks with restored Victorians, an old church on the corner, a high school with a track, a commuter rail within walking distance. There were some abandoned sites, lots under construction, empty storefronts, and stray cats, but nothing like the bombed-out shops of Sultan, its crumbled schools, week-old dog corpses, blood on the doorstep. Dara moaned in her sleep and turned on her side, her perfect butt cheek framed in the pale light. Her lovely arms silhouetted the wall, and her thick hair dressed the pillow. Nothing, it had no effect, as if Heidi's ability to love the little things had been singed, fizzled in a ring of fruit and a dead Sultanese woman lying on the sandy road. A mother, of course, with 3 kids, Heidi and 2 soldiers delivered the corpse to the family who lived in a thatched hut. The woman's 3 boys and husband met them at the door. They took the body bag, but didn't seem surprised. None of them cried or said anything, as if the woman's death were scripted. "I'm so sorry," Heidi said to the father. The mustached man in a robe looked Heidi in the eyes, then slammed the door in her face. She had to push back her tears the whole ride to the base. "Heidi," Dara said, turning to her on the bed, "are you awake?" Heidi's head was propped in her hand, and her Captain America shield tattoo shined on her wrist. Dara gently toed Heidi's knee, but she didn't respond even though she liked Dara's nimble feet. "Talk to me," Dara said with her throaty voice and her curvy lips. Heidi stared at the ceiling and began to count the little squares in each tile. "Are you thinking about that interview you got this afternoon? I know you're going to do fine. You're great at selling yourself." Heidi smiled slightly. "You know me so well." Dara again worked her toes up and down Heidi's leg, tickling the fuzzy hairs. With her hand, she gently squeezed Heidi's chin. "I want you to beat me," Heidi said, turning onto her elbow again and staring ahead of Dara. Dara rolled on her back and looked up. "It won't be that difficult," Heidi continued, almost robotically. "I've got all the soldier's gear. This'll add another dimension to our sex life." "You never wanted that before," Dara said. "Well, maybe I just want to try something new." "It's really weird." "It could be sexy, Dara. I've got a burqa, a turban, a hijab." A deep sigh escaped Dara. Then her eyes hardened and she smacked Heidi in the face. It was a light smack, a nothing smack. Heidi hardly felt it and almost laughed. "That's a start, I guess." "What you want? I don't know what you want," Dara said. "I want what I've always wanted," Heidi said, then felt like she had misspoken. "Well, what the f*** does that mean?" Dara kicked away the cover, and Heidi's muscular, tattooed calves revealed themselves. One of her best features, she thought. Dara's eyes seemed amused and angered, like those of the dead woman who wanted to feed the troops. "Maybe I'm not the one for you. Maybe I'll never be the one who you want me to be." Heidi felt a frost go up her leg. The sun, now brighter, slanted in the room through the blinds. "What if I don't wear the burqa?" Dara said. "Is that a deal breaker?" "What?" "You can tell our queer friends. Dara wouldn't don the hijab, so I dumped her ass. I bet they'll find that a hoot." "You know I'd never do that," Heidi said and clutched her knees. Dara got up, grabbed her robe off the small couch, and slammed the door on her way out. Heidi gnawed on the corner of her lip, then spat some dried skin. "What the f*** is wrong with me?" She then imagined a woman in a burqa shoving her foot down her mouth. Again she bit her lip and for a moment touched herself. Then she recalled the interview at the after-school program in the city. It was a chance at regaining some sense of normalcy. At the very least, it would get her ass out of the house. "I should apologize." This is the next scene coming up. This is the trip to the interview. At first, the train ride relaxed her, but with each stop, she got a little more excited. She looked out the window at the bright and cloudless sky. The landscape of bridge and sand reminded her of those abandoned training camps that her unit had captured from the Sultanese. Further on, near Secaucus, a junkyard full of yellow school buses, some long like torpedoes, others bulky like light tanks. Every freaking thing reminded her of the sand as the city approached through the scarred glass. She had to focus on what she would say at the interview. But as the train rattled along, she seemed to forget all the tips that she had studied online. Instead, a series of scorched images radiated through her mind, and she squeezed the arms of her seat. When she landed at Penn Station, she had a minor revelation. I function better in moving crowds. She enjoyed snaking around people. It reminded her of the touch football she used to play with her brother's friends. The faces always changed, yet they were somehow all the same. Characters she was able to decode through her training and deployment. A Long Island upper crust woman in a mink and a load of makeup. Everyday Joes and Janes in their business slacks and polished heels rushed to catch the train. Teenage girls in short skirts and long black coats, everybody in black, like an open market funeral. 2 Marines with M16s, guarded a drugstore. Heidi walked more quickly, even though she was 50 minutes early. She walked downtown instead of taking the train. Stepping amongst the nameless crowds felt wonderful, purposeful without needing to prove anything. Egg-white clouds topped the buildings and the occasional prim tree. The smell of mustard mixed with grilled kebab, endless whiffs of horse stirred something childlike in her, and she thought of Christmas. On 8th Avenue, she helped an old lady cross the street. Then she gave a shivering homeless man $1. Wasn't this what she was supposed to be doing overseas? She had arrived at the sandy dunes of Sultan almost 2 years ago after America had gained control of the situation and averted a full-scale Middle East war. Heidi believed that she would contribute to the peacekeeping effort in bombed-out places, but after her first week there, she realized the situation was more unstable, graver, and that the locals didn't fear death anymore. Near 8th Street, she lost herself in a crowd of international arts students, each one dressed sharply, wearing glasses of varying styles. Heidi smiled at an Asian girl with an ostrich feather crowning her hair. She felt like kissing her on the mouth and telling her how beautiful she was and how lucky not to have to see dead children floating in canals. A marching band suddenly emerged near West 4th Street and played New Orleans-style jazz. Heidi stopped in the middle of the block and felt her soul stirred. Why don't I come here more often? She took several pictures with her phone and sent them to Dara and wrote, "Wish you were with me." Heidi had first been exposed to big band jazz while in basic training down south. Dara didn't reply right away, but that was okay. Heidi had her interview to look forward to at the after-school program where she could help kids in English and math and be in the city 4 days a week. She walked further west and noticed how colorful were the buildings and people. Spiky, dyed hair, orange gloves and scarves. A man in a Batman cape and Speedos stood outside a gelato bar. A fairy tale land, even though she didn't live that far away. A croissant shop with 2 statuesque servers. Heidi imagined biting the neck of a pretty model and making her scream bloody murder. She turned onto a seedy block with a CD shop, a bar playing bad 90s music, and some hair dudes hanging up front. Where was the school located? A sex shop window flashed its all-purpose vibrators and rubbers. 2 stores down was another sex shop, bright with a t-shirt in the window that said, "Kitchen Bitch." The head shop that followed glowed with glass pipes. Heidi felt as if she had left Disneyland and fallen down a dark rabbit hole. I'll read the final scene of this excerpt. She still had about a half hour to kill, so she walked into one of the sex shops. A man and a woman browsed the video aisle, which was sectioned off according to fetish. She felt funny for a moment, then noticed a wall of costumes and accessories. She looked more closely at the display. There was combat gear, camouflage tops and bottoms, and she imagined role-playing with Dara in a budget hotel somewhere off the highway. Perhaps Dara would agree to donning the combat gear, and Heidi could wear the burqa. But there was something in her that seemed averse to anything war-related, whether it be a film or a game or a conversation. But why? What fears did it trigger inside her? "Are you looking for anything specific?" a man said with an Indian accent. Heidi stood at attention. "We have peep shows in the back. The girls will wear anything you ask." He was short and round with curly hair and a loose button-down shirt. "How do you know I like girls?" The man smiled with bright white teeth. "I know the customers." "I'm not your customer," Heidi said, half smiling. Had she been here once before and now couldn't recall? What if I need a burqa or a hijab? The man narrowed his eyes at her and licked his bottom lip. "I'm serious. That's what I'm into. I'm not asking for any other reason." The man tapped his chin, then disappeared behind the side counter. Interesting guy, but not to be taken seriously. She checked her wristwatch and saw that she had 20 minutes left before her interview, a lifetime it seemed. She looked at a tray of probes, sticks, and rods and wished Dara were more adventurous. The pudgy man returned and said, "What do you think?" It looked like a normal blue burqa to her, but now she wasn't sure what to do with it or why he'd even gotten it for her in the first place. She suddenly felt as though all the displays were staring at her. The rods and whips came to life and hissed. She looked about nervously, and the man read her discomfort. "Just bring it to the girl of your choice, and she'll wear it. It's $50 for 15 minutes. "What is?" Heidi said, dizzy with sensations. "Just go see a girl." He gestured towards the back of the shop. "I have one in mind. She's tall, big-boned. She likes your type." He looked Heidi up and down and escorted her to the back down a short flight of stairs. She gave herself over to this strange man in this strange city. He led her to a curtain where he took the burqa from her and said, "Have a seat inside and wait for the light above to turn red." He showed her inside, and she sat in a soft leather chair. "Get comfortable." Thank you. Thanks. Great.
So, do you want to do Q&A now?
Sure, yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah, some of you have the text. I know we had a few extra copies, and it might be easier for you if you have the text, but who has some questions for Boris? Yeah.
What inspired this? Did you get? I know it's fiction, but was there anything real about it, at all?
Here she said, this is fiction, but was there something real that inspired it?
Yeah, you know, I read a lot of nonfiction as well as fiction. I mean, I really believe that as a writer, you can't just read the genre that you write in. So one of my interests is history and is war history. And so for the past couple of years, I've been reading lots of oral histories of Iraqi veterans, veterans from Afghanistan. And since I've been writing stories about war, I thought I would like to write a story from the perspective of a female war veteran. This was actually a prompt that I assigned to my fiction class here about a year ago, and I gave the class a series of prompts to choose from, and nobody chose this prompt. And so I thought, well, I'll write the prompt, I'll choose it, and it, you know, led to this story.
What was the prompt?
The prompt was to write from the perspective of a female war veteran who was having trouble with her partner back at home. And so that was sort of the impetus to write the story.
And then you can be next.
Okay. When you're creating characters whose experiences are very different from your own, I would think you'd have to be particularly courageous, because do you ever think like, a reader or a listener will say, "Oh, you're writing about me and you've got it all wrong. That's not how a female war veteran thinks or acts. That's not how a lesbian lover thinks or acts. That's not how a sex shop owner thinks." Like it seems to me like it must take such courage to say, "I'm going to create this fictional character out of experiences that I haven't had."
Yeah.
Do you think about that, or do you just banish those thoughts? How do you?
No, I absolutely think about that. But for me, one of the challenges as a writer is to write from varying perspectives other than my own, because I kind of I like to equate writing with acting, in that the best actors can play any role, right? They can find a way to, you know, you can see Johnny Depp playing a transvestite in I can't remember the movie now, but anyway, yes.
It was Ed Wood, I think.
Okay, yeah, there's Ed Wood, and then Before Night Falls by Julian Schnabel. He played a transvestite there also, and he does it convincingly. So, yeah, one of the challenges for me is to try to write from perspectives that are very different from my own. And some of it is research, you know, reading these oral histories, reading accounts, talking to people, talking to veterans. But a lot of it, you guys, is just using my imagination, which I think is your strongest asset as a writer. But then to answer Chris's other question, well, how do you know that you're being convincing? Like, how do you really know? And this is where, just to piggyback off something that Professor Moss said, you can't write in a vacuum. You have to show your work to others. So for me, even if I try to write from the perspective of a female character, I'm going to show it to female friends of mine who are writers and who can kind of give me the scoop on whether I'm being genuine or not, or where those false notes are and what I can do about them. So it is part of the challenge, for sure.
It says here that you have a collection of speculative post-war stories. Are they all tied into each other, or are you like coming up with like different?
It's a good question. They are tied into each other in terms of their themes, and also just some of the conflicts, like the conflict in this story between Sultan and Aurelia, which, if you can read between the lines, you might see it as Israel and Palestine, for example. So these places reoccur in other stories, but the characters always change. I'm always trying to write from different perspectives. So this story is from the perspective of Westerners, U.S. war veterans. I have other stories from the perspective of people who were living in those occupied war zones. So it's really kind of a mix of perspectives.
Can you repeat the two countries you made up?
Sultan, S-U-L-T-A-N, and Aurelia, A-R-E-L-I-A. Like I said, I follow Middle East events and politics pretty closely, and for me, it's a jumping off point for some of my fiction.
I have a question. Sure. Just because it's something you brought up, based on a question that Chris asked about, do you get nervous about being authentic? And my thought immediately was, as a fiction writer, I get nervous about all sorts of things. And I wonder what do you think is this is such a general question, what's the hardest part about writing fiction, do you think, off the top of your head?
Yeah, I think, creating, I would say creating convincing characters and creating a convincing voice. I think if you can have the two working together, then plot isn't always what's most important, because I think most people, when they think about fiction, they think about story and narrative. But if there isn't a strong voice and there aren't interesting characters and there isn't an evocative setting, then it's just, it might as well be something you read in a newspaper that just states the facts. So I think for me, the biggest challenge is character, probably, and that's what I spend the most time thinking about before I start a story. I sort of have a private interview with my characters. I ask them all sorts of questions in a notebook, and I answer those questions. For example, what's your favorite film? Really generic questions, but questions that help me to understand my characters better. Questions that the reader doesn't necessarily need to know, but I need to know the answers to those questions because it helps me shape my characters. So I would say that's probably, for me, the most important part and the most difficult part.
And just a follow-up on that, and then I'll take another question out here. How many drafts do you think you've done of, let's say, what you read to us today? I know that's hard to say. You may have changed one word.
The story's my stories, when do you know a story is finished? Do you ever really know until it's published? And even if it's published, is it finished? This story's probably gone through 7 or 8 drafts, which for me actually isn't very much, just because I show it to my friends, and then maybe I'll show it to an editor, and maybe I'll show it to some other folks, and everybody always gives me some little piece that I can then integrate into my work. So it's really a long process, and I sort of lose count of the drafts because it takes a long time, sometimes years.
Is there more to the story, or does it end?
Yeah, there's more to it. I didn't want to read the whole thing because, I just didn't want to bore you to tears. So, there's probably, another half of this story. And if anybody's interested in reading the rest, you can see me and I'll hook you up. Okay. Other questions? Yes?
When you write these kinds of stories, do you have a target audience, or do you kind of think like, what would I want to read? Or is it like, you're like...
It's a really good question. It's a question that I grapple with, and I think a lot of writers grapple with, is who your audience is. Kurt Vonnegut said that you should write for only one person and one person only, yourself. Because if you open a window and you try to make love to the world, you might catch pneumonia. So, it's one of these things where I really write for myself, for what interests me the most, because the leap of faith that I'm taking, and I think many writers take, is that what interests me is going to also interest other people. And that's a leap of faith that I take as a writer. If I were just thinking about audience, I think that I would probably compromise some of the risks that I take, because I would want to appease people. And I don't want to appease people. I want to challenge people. Yeah. Yes?
Do you put yourself in a writing schedule?
It's a good question. Many writers I know need a schedule, but somebody like me who has no kids and doesn't have too many responsibilities besides work, what I do, I call guerrilla writing. That is to say, I write anywhere and wherever I can. And if that means in a notepad, if that means on my laptop, if that means, at a library computer, I try to write, let me be a little bit more specific, I try to write a little bit every day. But that writing doesn't mean like I'm coming up with something new. It could be editing, revising. To me, it's all part of the writing process. But luckily, I don't need a schedule for some reason, at least not yet. So yeah, when and where I can. Because I think I, like many writers and many artists, I have this internal fear that at some point I'm not going to be able to do it anymore. And so for me to avoid that, I need to keep doing it. And so I feel like I have to write as much as I can. And somebody gave me advice in grad school. He said, you should try to check into the office every day for at least 15 minutes. So I try to keep that in mind. I try to make sure every day I've done a little revising, a little editing, maybe a little bit of writing. Some of it's just note-taking. It's just processing ideas about characters. But anything connected to the writing process for me is writing. And should be for you guys too, as students. Writing isn't just the draft that you write, right? I mean, it's the process, as Professor Moss mentioned. Process is a big part of being a writer. Anybody else?
All right.
The back?
Our final question. I hope it's just fascinating. No pressure. But what's your question?
Do you ever lose yourself in your work?
Say that again?
Do you ever lose yourself in your work?
How do you mean exactly?
Like, have you ever had a story in your head that you just couldn't stop writing about?
Yeah. I would say, well, boy, that's a little difficult for me to answer. I think what happens for me is I have, again, characters in mind. They're people that I want to write about. And so once I have that person in mind, like this character in the story, Heidi, once I sort of figured out who she was, the rest became a lot easier. So I think I get lost in character, and then from there, the writing usually just comes out.
Okay. This was fantastic. You guys look terrific.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.